Picture a small town called Asheville, Vermont. Its population has never exceeded 847 souls. The roads are narrow, the houses old, and the maple trees grow so dense that even in summer, sunlight can barely reach the ground. A beautiful town. A quiet town. But every year, without fail, when the leaves begin to shift from green to deep red and amber, people start to disappear. No signs of struggle. No farewell notes. No footprints leading out of town. They simply vanish. And the remaining residents of Asheville? They have a name for it, spoken in hushed tones, almost like a prayer. The Hollow Season. October 2019. A young journalist named Daniel Mercer arrived in Asheville with one purpose, to write an investigative piece about the town for a well-known digital magazine based in New England. Daniel was not the kind of man who believed in folklore. To him, every mystery had a logical explanation. People disappeared because they wanted to, debt, broken families, trauma. Nothing supernatural. Nothing that couldn't be explained. At least, that's what he believed before he set foot in Asheville. The only inn in town was called the Maple Lodge, a two-story wooden structure that looked like it had been standing since the 19th century. Its owner, an elderly woman named Eleanor Marsh, greeted him with a smile that didn't quite feel warm. "You've come to write about us?" she asked, pulling a room key from a creaking reception desk drawer. "Yes, ma'am. I'm interested in the stories about residents disappearing every autumn," Daniel replied, keeping his tone professional. Eleanor paused. Her hand tightened around the key. "Stories," she repeated quietly. "Yes. Of course. Your room is on the second floor. Number 7. And, Mr. Mercer." She held his gaze with eyes that were impossible to read. "Don't open your window at night. The autumn air here, it doesn't agree with outsiders." Daniel smiled politely and nodded. He assumed it was just the quirk of an old woman. He was wrong. His first night in Asheville passed quietly. Daniel sat at the small desk in his room, opened his laptop, and began digging through digital archives about the town. What he found made his skin crawl. Over the past 30 years, 47 people had been reported missing from Asheville, all between October 1st and October 31st. Not a single one had ever been found. Not alive, and not as remains. The county police had investigated multiple times. The FBI had even stepped in back in 2004. The result? Nothing. As if the earth had swallowed them whole. The next day, Daniel began interviewing residents. The first person he found was Harold Voss, a man of about 70, sitting on a bench in front of the old general store. Harold had lived in Asheville his entire life. He had watched many people disappear, including his own wife, in October of 1998. "What happened to her, Mr. Voss?" asked Daniel, pen poised over his notebook. Harold didn't answer right away. He stared toward the forest at the edge of town, the maple forest whose leaves had already turned deep red, like dried blood. "She went for an afternoon walk. Said she wanted to see the foliage. The autumn colors here are beautiful, son." Harold paused. "I waited until dusk. She never came home. No one ever saw her again." "Did you suspect foul play? A killer, perhaps?" Harold let out a quiet grunt. "A killer doesn't make 47 people vanish without leaving a single trace. No blood. No torn clothing. Nothing." He looked at Daniel directly. "This isn't about people, son." Daniel continued his interviews with several other residents. Every answer was the same. Someone left. Didn't come back. No explanation. But there was one thing that caught his attention. Every time he asked about the maple forest at the edge of town, every single resident gave the exact same reaction, a brief silence, then a look away. As though the forest was something that simply wasn't to be spoken of. That afternoon, Daniel decided to visit the office of Sheriff Pete Calloway, the only law enforcement officer stationed in Asheville. Pete was a large man with a thick mustache and tired eyes. Not tired from lack of sleep, but tired from witnessing too many things he couldn't explain. "I've lost 3 people in my 8 years on the job," Pete said, unprompted. "Including my deputy. Last October." "What did the police do?" "Everything we could. Search parties in the forest. Missing persons announcements. County coordination. Nothing was found." Pete took a sip of his coffee. "You know what keeps me up at night?" Daniel shook his head. Not one of them showed any sign of planning to leave. Nobody packed a bag. Nobody withdrew their savings. Nobody said goodbye. They just stopped existing. Daniel wrote down every word. "Some residents believe this has something to do with the forest on the edge of town, Sheriff." Pete went still. He stared at Daniel with an expression caught somewhere between fear and anger. "You don't need to go in there," he finally said. "That's not a suggestion. That's an order." Of course, Daniel didn't listen. That night, around 10 p.m., when the entire town of Asheville seemed to have gone to sleep, Daniel put on his jacket, grabbed his flashlight and camera, and walked toward the maple forest at the edge of town. At first, the forest felt ordinary. Tall maple trees stretched upward, their red and orange leaves casting strange shadows in the moonlight. The air was cold and clean. There was no sound except the wind and his own footsteps. Daniel walked for about 15 minutes, snapping photos, jotting down notes. He was beginning to feel slightly ridiculous, venturing into the woods at midnight only to find nothing at all. And then he noticed something. The sound of crickets, which had been coming from every direction, suddenly stopped. All sound stopped. Even the wind. Daniel stood perfectly still, his flashlight cutting through the space between the trees. He held his breath, straining to hear anything at all. And then he heard it. The sound of dry leaves being pressed underfoot. Slow. Rhythmic. Like footsteps. But not human footsteps, too slow, too heavy, with too long a pause between each step. Daniel swung his flashlight toward the sound. There was nothing there. Only trees. Only darkness between the towering trunks. But then, at the very edge of his flashlight's reach, he saw something move. Not walking. Not running. Gliding. As though a shadow were moving without legs, passing through the space between 2 large trees, then dissolving into the darkness. Daniel didn't scream. His legs simply carried him, pure reflex, out of the forest, across the dew-covered grass, until he was back on the town road standing under a street lamp, gasping for air. He stood there for several minutes, his heart hammering. Then he looked at his camera. The photos he'd taken inside the forest, all of them were there, all of them normal, except the last one. And the last photo, taken only seconds before he ran. In the background, between the dark tree trunks, there was a figure standing. Tall. Far too tall for a human. With something resembling a head that was too large, tilted to one side, as though it had been watching Daniel from close range. But Daniel remembered clearly. When he took that photo, there was nothing there. The following morning, Daniel went to Asheville's only library, a small building that smelled of old paper and rotting wood. The librarian on duty was a young woman named Clara Whitfield. Unlike the other residents, Clara seemed different. More open. More willing to talk. "You want to know about the history of this town," she said, the moment Daniel explained his purpose. "Most residents don't like talking about it. But it's all here, if you want to look." She led Daniel to the very back of the shelves, filled with documents and books that looked as though they hadn't been touched in decades, and showed him a thick volume bound in dark leather. The Founding of Asheville, 1743 to 1820. Inside, Daniel found handwritten records by one of the town's founders, a man named Ezekiel Marsh, an ancestor of Eleanor Marsh, the innkeeper. And those records revealed everything. In the autumn of 1743, when the first settlers arrived in this valley, they discovered that the land was extraordinarily fertile. Harvests were abundant. The winters were milder than anywhere else in the region. But there was a price to be paid. On the first night of October 1743, 3 settlers vanished from their camp. The next morning, at the edge of the forest, the others found something, not a human body, not an animal, but something that made Ezekiel Marsh write in his journal with a trembling hand. We saw it at the tree line, standing and waiting. It did not attack us. It simply waited. And we all understood, without speaking a word, that this was an agreement. This land belonged to it long before us. And it was asking for payment. Daniel read that passage 3 times. An agreement, he murmured. Every October, said Clara quietly from behind him. That's why people never leave. They don't want to go because they're afraid. And they can't draw too much attention because they accept this. Daniel turned to face Clara. You knew about all of this? Clara looked at him with eyes that seemed far older than her face. Everyone knows, Daniel. The entire town knows. We just hope that every year, it will be satisfied with whoever it chooses. And we pray that the one chosen isn't us. That's insane, said Daniel. You could leave. You could get out of this town. Clara smiled, and for the first time, her smile felt like Eleanor Marsh's. Not warm. Not sincere. We've tried, Daniel. Those who leave Asheville before October ends, they always come back. She paused. In a condition we can't explain. That night was October 31st. Daniel had already booked a ticket on the first bus out the following morning. He wanted to leave Asheville, finish his article from a safe distance, and never return to this cursed town again. But around midnight, he heard a knock at his door. 3 knocks. Slow. Rhythmic. He opened the door. No one was there. But on the hallway floor, right in front of his door, lay a single sheet of aged paper, as though torn from an old book. Daniel picked it up and read it under the light of his room. Written there, in a handwriting he recognized from the book at the library, the handwriting of Ezekiel Marsh, dead for more than 200 years. It saw you in the forest. You saw it. Your name is now part of the agreement. You cannot leave. No one can leave after seeing it. Forgive us. Daniel froze. Then, slowly, he walked to his bedroom window, the window Eleanor Marsh had warned him never to open. He didn't open it. He only looked out. Below, in the front yard of the Maple Lodge, stood a figure. Tall. Impossibly tall. Its head touched the lowest branch of the maple tree, meaning it stood nearly 10 feet high. The figure was not moving. It was simply looking up, directly at Daniel's window. Directly into his eyes. And its face, if it could be called a face, was nothing but a darkness deeper than the night surrounding it. No eyes. No mouth. Only a darkness shaped like a head, tilted to one side, as though curious. Daniel could not move. He didn't know how long he stood there. All he knew was that when the first pale light of dawn finally crept through the clouds, the figure was gone. Daniel ran out of his room, down to the reception desk, and slammed his key onto the counter. Eleanor Marsh was already there. Sitting in her chair. A cup of tea in her hands. Her eyes watching Daniel without expression. The first bus leaves at 6, she said calmly. I'm leaving, said Daniel, his voice shaking. That's what they all say, Eleanor replied quietly. Then she added, in a tone that sounded not like a threat, but a simple statement of fact. Safe travels, Mr. Mercer. See you next October. Daniel Mercer left Asheville on November 1st, 2019. His article was never published. His editor said he quit without warning. His friend said he was different after he returned, quieter, more prone to staring into the distance, more likely to lock himself in his apartment. Exactly 1 year later, in October 2020, Daniel Mercer was reported missing from his apartment in Boston. No signs of struggle. No farewell note. No trace. Only one thing was found by police on his desk, a sheet of paper written in a calm and steady hand, as though composed with great peace of mind. On it were just 2 words. I'm home. That is the story of the Hollow Season. A small town that holds an ancient agreement. Something that existed long before humans ever set foot on that land. Something that continues to wait every year when the leaves turn red, when the air grows cold, when autumn arrives. If you ever hear of a town called Asheville, Vermont, don't go there in October. Don't enter its forest. And never, never look out your window in the middle of the night. Do you believe a town like Asheville could exist? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for the next horror story.